Hello, friends, and welcome. Come sit down, get comfortable, and let's step together into a warm little world of everyday adventures. These stories are gentle, cozy, and meant to make you feel right at home, like sitting by the fire on a calm evening. So relax, take a deep breath, and let's begin today's tale. The Overgrown Turning. Barnaby the Hedgehog prided himself on knowing nearly every inch of the woodland. His paws had trundled along the mossy riverbank paths, crossed meadow trails bright with daisies, and even braved the dark of the hollow oak track during late summer. Yet one golden morning, as he walked with his basket on the way to Tom's burrow, he noticed something peculiar. It was an old turning, so old it had nearly disappeared beneath bramble and nettle. The path slipped off from the main lane near the alder tree, curving toward the deeper woods. The morning light caught on it in a strange way, showing him where the undergrowth had parted, as if the forest itself had whispered, "Look here, Barnaby." Barnaby paused, balancing his basket on his hip. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "I've walked this way 100 times, yet I've never set paw on that turning." He nearly carried on. After all, Tom would be waiting with tea, and Barnaby hated to keep friends waiting. But something tugged at him. Perhaps it was the curiosity hedgehogs are not usually known for, or perhaps the glimmer of adventure, quiet and homely though it might be. He stepped onto the overgrown trail. At once the world hushed. The branches leaned closer, the undergrowth whispered against his spines, and the air smelled of damp earth and hidden roots. The path twisted gently downhill, where little ferns pushed between stones. A blackbird, startled, flew up with a sharp cry. Barnaby felt half proud, half nervous. "Not much of a road, but it leads somewhere," he said under his breath. "And anywhere worth going always starts with a step." The path did not stretch far, at least not yet. Soon the hedgehog reached a small clearing where moss carpeted the ground like velvet. A hollow log lay at its center, and atop it grew a patch of mushrooms, pale as moonlight. The place was quiet, almost solemn, but not unfriendly. Barnaby stood a long while, paws on his basket, breathing in the damp, green smell. At last he turned back, marking the way with a pebble. He would not forget. That evening, he told Tom and Edwin about his discovery. Tom scoffed, stirring his stew. "Humph. Old paths are old for a reason. Best stick to the well-trodden ones." But Edwin's eyes lit up. An overgrown turning? A clearing with moss and mushrooms? "Barnaby, you must take me there. Such places are full of character. I could sketch for days." Barnaby chuckled, puffing his pipe. "Well, perhaps tomorrow, if we bring a lantern or two." The following afternoon, Barnaby led Edwin to the hidden turning. He had trimmed away some nettles with his shears that morning, so their passage was easier. Edwin followed eagerly, notebook and stub of pencil already in paw, his scarf trailing behind him. The path wound as before, quiet and close. When they reached the mossy clearing, Edwin gave a little gasp. "Oh, Barnaby, it's like a secret chamber. The moss is thick enough to be a rug, and those mushrooms, they glow, do you see? Just faintly, like they've captured the dusk." Barnaby squinted. "I'll grant they're peculiar." Edwin set himself upon the hollow log and began to sketch. Barnaby, meanwhile, poked about the edges of the clearing. He found a stone half buried with lichen, its surface flat and wide enough to serve as a little table. Setting down his lantern, though it was still daylight, he placed his basket atop it. Inside were slices of brown bread, a hunk of cheese, and a flask of cider. "You've thought ahead," Edwin said with approval. "Old paths make me hungry," Barnaby replied with a grin. They sat together, nibbling their meal, while Edwin drew the way the branches arched overhead like a roof. The lantern flickered to life as dusk came on, sending gold light over the mushrooms, which seemed to glow brighter in return. Barnaby felt the strangeness again, not alarming, only unfamiliar. when Tom appeared, stomping down the path with his grumbles and mutters. Barnaby nearly dropped his bread in surprise. "Couldn't let you two get lost," the mole said, though he looked relieved to see them safe. "Besides, stew's not the same eaten alone." Tom carried a pot wrapped in cloth, still steaming. They set it on the flat stone, and the three of them shared supper there in the clearing. The lantern glowed, the mushrooms gleamed, and for the first time, the forgotten path seemed less lonely. "Not so bad," Tom admitted afterward, licking his spoon. "But don't expect me to go tramping about down here every night." Barnaby only chuckled, satisfied. The old turning had brought them a new place to gather, and he felt sure it would not remain forgotten much longer. The next morning, Barnaby returned alone, basket in paw, with a broom and a rake tied over his shoulder. He was no dreamer like Edwin, but he believed in tidy usefulness. If they meant to visit the clearing again, it deserved to be kept in fair order. He swept fallen leaves from the moss, careful not to disturb the mushrooms. He raked away the brambles edging the path and righted the stones where roots had pushed them askew. Birds scolded him for his fuss, but Barnaby hummed as he worked, content to make the place welcoming. Edwin appeared midway through, pencil smudges on his nose. "I thought you'd be here. Look, I brought parchment for a larger sketch. Hold that broom a moment. I want to catch the shape of your stance." Barnaby rolled his eyes but obliged, standing stout and sturdy with broom in paw. Soon Edwin had captured him in lines and shading, a portrait of a hedgehog caretaker among moss and lantern light. By afternoon, Tom trudged down again, carrying a short plank. "If you're determined to fuss about, might as well make a proper bench. Can't have my back aching on a log." The three set to work, sawing and hammering with more enthusiasm than skill. At last, a crooked little bench stood by the hollow log, sturdy if not elegant. That evening, when the sun slipped low and shadows lengthened, the three friends sat upon their new bench, weary but pleased. The lantern glowed at their feet, and Edwin's sketch of Barnaby leaned against the hollow log, fluttering in the breeze. "It's becoming a place of our own," Edwin said softly. Barnaby puffed on his pipe. "Aye, funny how an old forgotten turn can lead to something worth keeping." A week later, as frost silvered the meadow grass, Barnaby and Tom arrived at the clearing to find someone already there. It was Mrs. Whistle, the squirrel widow, wrapped in her shawl, hands busy with her knitting. She looked up, startled at first, then smiled. "I hope you don't mind. I found your little bench and thought it too fine to leave empty. The path called to me." Barnaby, though surprised, was not displeased. "You're welcome here, Mrs. Whistle. We were only just coming to light the lantern." Soon Edwin appeared as well, and together they shared hot tea from Barnaby's flask while Mrs. Whistle told them stories of her younger days, of gathering acorns in great sacks, of storms weathered in tree hollows, of dances held in the meadow when the moon was bright. Her voice wove a spell around them, gentle and homely. The lantern flickered, the moss glowed faintly, and Barnaby realized the clearing was no longer just a curiosity or a secret. It had become a gathering place, open to whoever might wander its turning. As more days passed, the clearing became part of their lives. Barnaby tended it with his broom and rake. Edwin sketched its every angle, and Tom brought odds and ends to improve the bench. Mrs. Whistle returned often, and once even the jay stopped by, leaving a shiny button on the flat stone for luck. One evening, as they all sat together watching the lantern glow, Edwin suggested, "We ought to give it a name. Every proper place has a name." Tom grunted. "Names make things fussier than they are." But Barnaby considered, "It's been forgotten long enough. Perhaps it's time to call it something new." After much discussion, Edwin favoring something poetic like Starry Hollow, Tom pushing for Mossy Spot, and Mrs. Whistle gently proposing the lantern clearing, they settled on the last. It suited the place. Simple, warm, and true. So the clearing became the lantern clearing. From that night onward, it was no longer hidden or overgrown, but a part of their woodland story, a place of moss, mushrooms, lantern light, and fellowship. Barnaby, watching the glow upon the trees, thought with satisfaction, an old path, but a new beginning. Not a bad trade. Frost had grown heavier by late autumn, dusting every hedge and burrow roof with silver before dawn. Barnaby the hedgehog was up early most mornings, his breath curling like smoke as he carried kindling from his shed. The lantern clearing, which had been a secret for only a short time, was already dear to him and the others. And now, with winter whispering at their paws, he wanted to be sure it was properly prepared. He trundled down the winding path with his basket filled to the brim. Inside were a tin of biscuits, a bundle of firewood tied with twine, and, tucked carefully in the corner, a little clay pot of jam he had made from late blackberries. His spines were tipped with frost by the time he reached the clearing, but the sight made him smile. Already, Edwin was there, perched on the crooked bench with his long scarf wrapped about his neck, sketchbook open. "Morning, Barnaby," Edwin called, pencil wagging in greeting. "I'm trying to capture the way the frost glitters on the mushrooms. Look, it's as though the clearing wears a crown of stars." Barnaby puffed and set down his basket. "You and your poetry. A crown of frost still melts come midday." Edwin laughed lightly, but his paw kept sketching, and Barnaby knew he was in no mood to be interrupted. So the hedgehog busied himself with stacking wood neatly by the flat stone they'd made into a table. He struck a match, coaxing a little fire to life in the small ring of stones they had built together the week before. The flame crackled warmly, and soon the smell of wood smoke curled through the clearing. By and by Tom arrived, huffing and muttering, with his sack slung across his shoulder. "HRRMPH, Barnaby, you're a fool, lugging all this every morning. Best way to keep a place warm in winter is not to sit in the blasted cold to begin with." Barnaby chuckled, but his eyes softened when he saw Tom's sack was full of tools, a short-handled hammer, nails wrapped in a rag, and even a square of canvas. "Not fond of the cold, are you?" Barnaby teased. "Not fond of you lot catching pneumonia while you sit about talking." Tom grunted, kneeling by the bench. "Figure I'd rig some cover. Keep the snow off when it comes." Barnaby and Edwin exchanged a glance, both smiling. For all his grumbles, Tom had a heart stout as oak roots. Mrs. Whistle arrived later with her knitting tucked under one arm and a basket of roasted chestnuts under the other. She settled herself on the bench, clucked approvingly at the canvas Tom was stretching above their little circle, and passed out the chestnuts. "No place is worth having if it cannot be shared through winter," she said firmly. And so they worked together through the morning, hammering posts, stretching canvas, sweeping leaves, and mending their bench until the clearing looked half like a woodland sitting room. Barnaby's fire smoked cheerfully, the mushrooms gleamed as if pleased by all the bustle, and Edwin captured the whole scene in his sketchbook. Tom frowning in concentration, Mrs. Whistle bent over her knitting, and Barnaby himself, stout and busy at the fire. By afternoon, the clearing felt different. No longer merely a place to pause, it was becoming a true gathering spot, capable of standing against winter. Barnaby, sitting with his pipe as the fire crackled, thought, "A hedgehog needs no palace when he has friends and a place to belong." The first snowfall came sooner than expected. Overnight, the meadow was blanketed in white, each branch laced with silver, the burrows tucked beneath soft mounds like sleeping beasts. Barnaby woke to the hush only snow can bring, the kind that swallows sound, leaving the world muffled and still. He strapped on his stoutest boots, pulled a woolen scarf about his neck, and trudged to the lantern clearing. His breath puffed in white clouds, and each step crunched in the untouched snow. At first he feared the path might be too buried to follow, but as he neared the alder tree, he saw small prints already pressed into the snow. Thin squirrel paws, a mole's dragging step, and Edwin's unmistakable long strides. When Barnaby arrived, the clearing looked utterly transformed. The canvas roof sagged under snow. The mushrooms wore white caps like bakers' hats, and the fire ring was nearly hidden. But the lantern glowed bravely, hung from a post Tom had fixed, and beneath the canvas sat his friends, wrapped in shawls and coats, cups of steaming cider in their paws. "There he is," Edwin called cheerfully. "Barnaby, you're late." HRRMPH. Hedgehogs don't hurry in snow, Barnaby replied, though his eyes twinkled as he brushed himself off and joined them. Mrs. Whistle had brought spiced biscuits, their scent mingling with the steam of cider. Tom had dragged in an extra plank to raise the canvas, muttering about proper tension as though they were rigging a ship's sail. Edwin, meanwhile, had been sketching again, the snow caught in his lines as gentle arcs. As a fire crackled to life, their talk turned to winter stories. Mrs. Whistle told of the year snow lay so deep that she and her husband had tunneled from tree to tree beneath it. Tom spoke of a night when his lantern failed and he had to follow the sound of owls to find his way home. Even Edwin shared tales, though his were colored with imagination. He described starlight falling on snow as though the sky itself had come down to rest. Barnaby listened, puffing smoke from his pipe, content with the warmth of friendship. He did not often tell stories, but when pressed, he spoke of his youth, of learning which routes kept best through winter, and the time he once slept through an entire snowstorm, waking to find himself sealed into his burrow like a jar. The clearing rang with laughter, softened by the snow. They ate, they talked, they dozed by turns. The snow outside deepened, but within their circle, the fire glowed and the lantern shone, and Barnaby thought once again, this place was meant for more than moss and mushrooms. It was meant for us. One morning, after a night of heavy snow, Barnaby made his way to the lantern clearing with some effort. The path was half hidden, the alder's branches bowing under their load. He was nearly there when he heard a voice, light, cheerful, and unfamiliar. "Ho there! Is this the way to the lantern spot?" Barnaby froze, spines prickling. Visitors were not unusual now, but this was someone new. Out from the trees bounded a young hare, tall-eared and bright-eyed, with a sprig of holly tucked behind one ear. He carried nothing but a knapsack slung across his shoulder. "Name's Jasper," the hare said, breath puffing. "I heard from a jay that there's a warm clearing hereabouts, with friends who gather. Thought I'd see for myself." Barnaby narrowed his eyes, but waved him along. "Follow me, then, but mind your manners." When they arrived, the others looked up in surprise. Mrs. Whistle nearly dropped her knitting. Tom squinted suspiciously, and Edwin gave a delighted exclamation, already reaching for his sketchbook. A hare, just the shape this place needed. Jasper grinned, shaking snow from his ears. "Well, I don't mean to intrude. I'll be off if you'd rather keep to yourselves." But Mrs. Whistle clucked her tongue. "Nonsense. No fire should be kept from cold paws. Sit, lad." And so Jasper joined them, telling of his wanderings across meadow and wood, of how he'd followed birds and streams, never stopping long in one place. He had an easy laugh, and though Tom muttered about strays, even he softened after Jasper helped tighten the canvas roof and hauled in fresh firewood. By day's end, Jasper was laughing beside them, cheeks pink from cider, paws stretched toward the fire. Barnaby eyed him with quiet approval. The lantern clearing, it seemed, had room for more than just its founders. As winter deepened, Edwin proposed something new. We ought to hold a lantern festival. Just one night, when everyone brings a lantern of their own. Imagine it, the whole clearing shining. Mrs. Whistle clapped her paws in delight, and even Tom, after much muttering, agreed it might be worth a try. Barnaby, practical as ever, only asked, "And who will make all these lanterns?" The days that followed were full of preparation. Mrs. Whistle sewed little bags of colored cloth to slip over candles. Edwin shaped paper shades and painted stars across them. Tom hammered stakes and hooks into the ground, muttering at every slip of the hammer. Barnaby, though he claimed it foolishness, carved out 2 sturdy lanterns from hollowed gourds, their sides etched with simple patterns of leaves. On the chosen night, the snow lay clean and white, the sky bright with stars. One by one, friends arrived from all corners of the woodland. The jay, the blackbird, a family of dormice, even the badger from the hill. Each carried a lantern, some plain, some bright with color, some flickering, some steady. The clearing blazed with light, reflections dancing across snow and mushrooms, the canvas roof glowing from within. The fire crackled merrily, and the air was alive with chatter and laughter. They shared stews and pies, songs and stories, until the whole clearing seemed to hum with life. Barnaby, standing with his paws folded, felt something swell in his chest. What had begun as a forgotten path was now a place of joy for many. Perhaps it was never ours alone, he thought. Perhaps it was meant for all who wander. Not every night was lively. After the festival, the clearing returned to quieter rhythms. Some evenings it was only Barnaby and Tom, sitting side by side, saying little while the fire popped. Other times, Edwin sketched while Mrs. Whistle hummed, and Jasper dozed, ears twitching in his sleep. One evening, Barnaby arrived late. The snow was thin, the air cold enough to sting. When he reached the clearing, he found only the lantern burning, left by someone else, its glow steady on the moss. He sat alone on the bench, pipe in paw, and for a long while simply listened to the rustle of trees, the faint hoot of an owl, the whisper of snow falling. And he thought, perhaps it's what makes this place dear. Sometimes it's full of voices, sometimes only silence, but it always welcomes us back. When he finally rose to leave, he looked once more at the lantern's glow. A good name, after all, he said quietly. The lantern clearing. And with that, Barnaby padded back into the snow, the light shining behind him like a promise. Barnaby awoke to silence. Not the usual hush of winter mornings, but something deeper, thicker, as though the world itself were holding its breath. He rolled from his bed, pulled on his woolen waistcoat, and pushed open the heavy wooden door of his burrow. The sight stopped him in his tracks. Snow had fallen in the night with a fury, draping the hedgerows, burying fences, and covering the lane in a seamless, white expanse. His own little garden gate was invisible, the path to the clearing lost under drifts nearly to his middle. HRRMPH, Barnaby muttered, puffing a cloud of frosty breath. Well, if the world wants to bury me, it'll have to try harder. He fetched his stout walking stick and set off, plunging through the snow, each step an effort. It was not long before he met Tom, who had dug himself out with a spade nearly as tall as his mole body. "Barnaby," Tom called, voice muffled under his thick cap. "Roads are gone. The paths are swallowed. We'll never reach the clearing." "Nonsense," Barnaby puffed. "We'll just make a new path. This snow won't last forever, but while it's here, we'll carve through it." So together they dug, Tom scooping, Barnaby stomping, until they made a narrow trail toward the lantern clearing. They passed hedges bent low with weight, branches crusted in silver, even a poor rabbit hole sealed like a corked bottle. When they arrived, they found Edwin already there, breathless but triumphant, having leapt and waded his way across fields. His scarf was wound around his ears, his tail dusted with snow, but his eyes gleamed. "Marvelous!" Edwin cried, sketchbook clutched tight to his chest. "It's as though the whole world has been reset, every mark wiped away. Fresh, new, waiting to be written on. Barnaby leaned on his stick, huffing. Fresh or not, I'll be glad when I can see my doorstep again. Mrs. Whistle came last, trudging behind with a sled piled high with baskets. She shook the snow from her shawl and said briskly, "If we're snowed in, we may as well make the best of it. I brought bread, butter, and a pot of jam." And so, though the snow had buried the world, the friends gathered under their canvas roof, fire blazing, mugs steaming, while outside the woods lay silent. Their clearing was a bright circle of warmth in a sea of white, proof that no snowstorm could keep them from one another. A few days later, Jasper the hare bounded into the clearing with a gleam in his eye. "The stream's frozen solid," he announced. "Smooth as glass, clear as crystal. Come on, let's see." Barnaby frowned. "Streams aren't for sliding about on, lad. They're for drinking from, and even then only when the water's flowing proper." But curiosity won out, and soon the whole company had trudged after Jasper, winding down the woodland path until the sound of trickling gave way to silence. The stream lay stiff and shining, its surface glazed in ice. Sunlight glanced off it in pale beams, scattering across the snow. Jasper hopped onto the ice, ears high. "Look at this. You can see the pebbles right below." He slid, paws flailing, but laughed all the while. Edwin, ever eager, tried next. He slipped, stumbled, and landed in a heap, but came up grinning. What a feeling! Like flying without wings. Mrs. Whistle tooted, but even she could not resist testing the eyes, moving carefully, shawl trailing behind her. Tom stood on the bank with his arms crossed. "Madness," he muttered. "Thin ice, thin bones, that's what you'll get." Barnaby watched, torn between caution and the sparkle of his friend's laughter. At last, with a sigh, he stepped gingerly onto the stream. His boots squeaked, his balance wobbled, but he moved a few inches, then a few more. And when he slid just a little and felt the cold wind rush past his spines, even Barnaby chuckled. For hours they played, sliding, falling, laughing, until the sun dipped and shadows stretched long. At last they trudged back to the clearing, cheeks flushed, paws tingling with cold. As Barnaby settled by the fire, pipe in paw, he admitted grudgingly, "A stream's not a toy. But once in a lifetime, it's worth remembering how it feels to slip and laugh like children." One evening, Barnaby was the last to leave the clearing. The fire had been banked low, the canvas dusted with snow, and one by one his friends had gone their ways. Only the lantern remained, glowing faintly by the alder's trunk. Barnaby hesitated. It was habit to leave it burning, a signal to any traveler, but something in the stillness made him pause. He stared at that small circle of light surrounded by darkness and snow, and for the first time, he felt its weight. The next day, he mentioned it to the others. "That lantern burns every night. But who lights it? Who tends it if not us? And if one of us forgets, what then?" Edwin tilted his head thoughtfully. "It burns because we will it too. That's enough." Mrs. Whistle frowned. "But Barnaby's right. A fire untended can die. Perhaps we should share the duty. Each of us take a night to light and check it." And so they did. Tom, though reluctant, made a chart on a scrap of bark, marking names and nights. Jasper skipped his turn once, and Barnaby scolded him thoroughly. Edwin, ever whimsical, painted little stars on the lantern's sides. The lantern became more than a light. It was a promise. Whoever came first would strike the match, and whoever stayed last would douse the flame. And so the clearing was never dark, never empty, but always waiting, always warm. Not long after, strange marks appeared outside the clearing. Long, looping tracks, not made by hare or mole or hedgehog. They curved near the canvas, circled the fire, then vanished into the trees. "Fox," Tom muttered grimly, paw tracing the marks. Jasper's ears twitched. Could be badger. Mrs. Whistle shook her head. No badger walks so lightly. The mystery lingered for days. Each morning, new tracks, sometimes closer, sometimes further. Barnaby insisted they carry on as usual, though he kept his stick near at paw. Edwin, of course, grew fascinated, sketching the patterns, wondering aloud what story they told. One night, when the snow fell soft and thick, Barnaby stayed behind alone. He sat by the fire, lantern glowing, and waited. Hours passed. Then movement. A shadow, pale against the snow, slipped between the trees. It was not fox or badger, but a weasel, thin and shivering, nose twitching as he crept closer to the fire's warmth. Barnaby rose slowly. "No harm in warmth," he said gruffly. "Come closer, if you've sense enough." The weasel froze, then bolted back into the woods. Barnaby sighed, shaking his head. Some creatures don't know how to accept kindness. But after that, he left an extra crust of bread near the clearing each evening, just in case. And though the tracks never came close again, Barnaby sometimes felt eyes watching from the trees, and he hoped that whoever was found comfort, even if only from afar. By late winter, the days began to stretch, a little more light in the mornings, a little more warmth in the afternoons. Icicles dripped, snow softened, and the frozen stream began to sing again with running water. The friends gathered at the lantern clearing, sitting in the weak sun. Mrs. Whistle's knitting grew brighter, stitches of yellow and green. Jasper bounded about, ears high, declaring he could smell spring. Edwin sketched the alder tree budding with promise. Barnaby puffed his pipe and watched them all. "Don't be fooled. Winter's still got teeth. But the worst may be behind us." They spoke of spring plans, gardens to be planted, repairs for burrows, paths to be cleared. Tom muttered about leaks to fix. Mrs. Whistle promised to share cuttings of her herbs. Even Barnaby allowed that he might try peas again this year, if the ground thawed in time. As the fire crackled and the lantern burned, they sat together, dreaming of days ahead. The snow would return, yes, but so too would blossoms, bees, and green hedges. And as Barnaby looked around at his friends, at Tom's steady frown, Mrs. Whistle's bright eyes, Edwin's sketches, Jasper's boundless energy, he thought, "We have made something strong here. Stronger than snow, stronger than cold. A place to return to, season after season." The lantern clearing, born in autumn, had carried them through winter. Now it waited, ready to welcome spring. The woods had grown used to thaw. Dripping icicles, softened snowbanks, trickles running down the sides of mole tunnels. But then, one morning in late February, the sky turned a hard pewter, the clouds sagged low, and the wind carried with it a sharp edge. Barnaby awoke to the smell of snow, sharp and clean. When he opened his door, it was as though the world had been erased in a single night. Snow lay higher than he had seen all winter, piled against hedges and buried over fences, as if the forest itself had been smothered under a giant's quilt. "Well," he muttered, buttoning his coat. "So much for spring." It was a battle just to reach the clearing. The snow came nearly to Barnaby's shoulders, and even with his stick, each step was an effort. Along the way, he passed Tom, who was tunneling under the drifts like a ship carving through the sea. "This is unnatural," Tom grumbled. The ground had thawed. I'd seen earthworms. Earthworms, Barnaby. And now this. By the time they reached the clearing, Jasper was there already, sitting atop a snowdrift like a king on a throne. His fur was dusted with powder, and his ears quivered with delight. "Magnificent," he cried. "The wood's transformed. It's like a whole new kingdom." Mrs. Whistle arrived with a sled creaking under the weight of blankets, jars, and bread. "If we're to be snowed in, we'll make it comfortable," she said firmly, cheeks flushed from the cold. Edwin, late as always, staggered in, his sketchbook clutched tight. muttering about the light. "You don't get shadows like this in any other season," he said breathlessly, already scribbling in the margins. "Everything is softened, blurred, and yet the edges glow. Fascinating." They huddled under the canvas, which sagged dangerously under the weight of snow, and Barnaby spent half the day stomping about with his stick, knocking drifts free. The fire roared, mugs steamed, and outside the storm raged, white flakes sweeping sideways like darts. It might have been miserable, but instead, there was laughter. Mrs. Whistle passed around honey-buttered bread. Jasper challenged Edwin to snow duel sketches, each drawing the wildest shapes they imagined in the drifting piles. Tom fixed a drafty flap of the canvas with twine, and Barnaby, though stiff from shoveling, leaned back at last, puffing his pipe. He thought, "If we can weather this together, we can weather anything." A week after the great storm, when paths were cleared again and the air felt almost kind, Jasper bounded into the clearing with wide eyes. "I saw smoke," he cried. "Not from a chimney we know. Beyond the hollow, near the old ash tree." Barnaby stiffened. "No one lives beyond the hollow. Not since old Badger left years ago." "Then someone's come back," Jasper said, stamping snow from his paws. The friends debated. Tom distrusted the news immediately. Smoke means fire. Fire means trouble. Best leave well enough alone. But Edwin was intrigued. A new neighbor, or perhaps a traveler in need. "We must at least look." Barnaby agreed reluctantly. And so the next day, they trudged together past the hollow. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke. At last they found it. A small cabin, half buried in snow, smoke curling from a crooked chimney. It was not empty. A figure stood outside, bundled in heavy fur, chopping wood. When he turned, they saw it was indeed a badger, broad, scarred, and older than any of them. His eyes were sharp, but not unkind. "Visitors," he rumbled. His voice was deep, slow, as though dragged up from the earth. "Haven't had those in years." Barnaby bowed slightly. "Barnaby Hedgehog, of the Lantern Clearing. These are my friends. We thought this part of the woods abandoned." "Abandoned? Perhaps. But I've returned." The badger leaned on his axe. "Name's Garrick. Winter's long, and it's colder without a fire. I'll not trouble you, unless you trouble me." The friends exchanged glances. Mrs. Whistle, ever practical, stepped forward with a loaf of bread. "Neighbors share," she said, pressing it into Garrick's paws. "You'll find the clearing warmer than solitude." The badger studied her, then nodded. "Perhaps I'll come by." As they walked back, Barnaby felt uneasy. Garrick had not been rude, but there was a weight to him, a heaviness, like an old tree rooted deep. Still, he thought, perhaps even old roots could find new soil. By March, the world began to shift. The snow still lay thick, but it grew softer, slushy underpaw. Water trickled, unseen at first, then louder, bolder, until the woods were filled with the gurgle of melting streams. Barnaby stood at his doorstep one morning and heard it clearly. Drip, drop, trickle, rush. The thaw had come. At the clearing, Mrs. Whistle had traded her thick shawl for a lighter one, bright green. "Spring knitting," she said proudly. Jasper tore about shouting, "The ground's alive! The ground's alive!" Tom muttered about floods, but even he looked relieved. Edwin, of course, was in rapture. He dipped his brush into melted snow water and painted furiously. "There's color again," he exclaimed. "Not white, not gray, blue shadows, green shoots, golden light." The thaw brought work. Paths had to be cleared of slush. Barnaby dug channels so water would drain from gardens. Tom repaired tunnels damaged by melt. Jasper discovered worms wriggling at last, and Mrs. Whistle planted early parsley in a sheltered pot. One evening, they sat together watching the stream rush, swollen and foaming. The sound filled the air, louder than any of their chatter. "It's like the forest is singing," Edwin whispered. Barnaby puffed his pipe, watching ice chunks tumble past. "Aye, singing of what comes next. It was not long before Garrick appeared at the lantern clearing. He came silently one evening, looming out of the dusk with his heavy coat and scarred muzzle. The friends stiffened, but Mrs. Whistle waved him closer. "Come by the fire," she said briskly. "No sense standing in the cold." Garrick hesitated, then settled himself on a log. He said little, only nodding when spoken to, listening with eyes half shut. Barnaby watched him carefully. Jasper, of course, pelted him with questions. Where had he been? Why had he returned? Did he like honey cake? At last Garrick spoke, voice like gravel. "I've lived far, wandered wide, but would call one home, even when home is changed." It was not much, but enough. Edwin drew his likeness by firelight, fascinated by the lines of his face. Mrs. Whistle pressed a steaming mug into his paws. Tom muttered about heavy paws crushing tunnels, but not loud enough for Garrick to hear. When Garrick left, silence lingered. "He's no threat," Mrs. Whistle said firmly. "Just lonely." Barnaby said nothing, but inside he felt the weight again. Garrick carried something heavy, whether sorrow, anger, or simply years. Barnaby could not yet tell. The snow withdrew at last. Retreating into shaded hollows, earth showed itself in patches, dark, damp, alive. And one morning, Edwin cried out in delight, "A flower!" The first flower, near the alder tree. A crocus had pushed through, its purple petals trembling in the breeze. They all gathered around, marveling. Jasper bent low to sniff it. Tom shook his head, muttering about fragile things, and Mrs. Whistle nearly wept. Barnaby stared longest. That single bloom meant more than any thaw, more than running streams. It meant survival, renewal, promise. "Spring," he said simply, pipe smoke curling in the bright air. That evening, they lit the lantern as always, but it seemed brighter. The clearing itself seemed to breathe easier, and though Garrick lingered at the edge, silent, Barnaby thought perhaps even the badger felt it too. The crocus stood, fragile yet defiant, a herald of the season to come. Thank you so much for joining me in this chapter of Willow Lane. I hope the quiet moments, the snow-dusted paths, and the warmth of the hearth brought a little peace to your day. If you enjoyed this cozy tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who could use a bit of calm and comfort. Until next time, may your evenings be warm, your days be gentle, and your heart always find the quiet joys in life.